"You're not welcome at this table," my son-in-law said, loud enough for everyone to hear on Thanksgiving night, in the dining room I'd built with my own hands 31 years ago. He said it like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. I set down the bowl of mashed potatoes I'd been carrying, looked at him once, and walked to the front closet. What I did next changed everything he thought he knew about who I was. The smell of roasting turkey had been filling the house since 6 that morning. I'd been up since 5, the way I always am, standing at the counter in my wool socks while Etobicoke was still dark outside the kitchen window. November in Ontario does that. Presses down on everything before sunrise. I'd rubbed the bird with butter and thyme the night before, the same way my wife used to, and set it in the oven before the rest of the world woke up. My daughter and her husband had been living with me for 2 years and 4 months by then. I know the number exactly because I wrote it in my daybook the afternoon they moved in. September 3rd. I write things down. 38 years as a structural engineer teaches you to document everything. Numbers don't argue with you. It had started with a phone call the previous September. My daughter's voice was tight on the line, the way it gets when she's trying not to cry but losing the battle. "Dad, Brendan's company is in trouble. We need somewhere to go, just for a little while, until we figure it out," she said. A little while the way people say it when they mean something longer but can't bring themselves to admit it yet. I told her to come home. They arrived in 2 vehicles, 3 large moving boxes, and a silence between them that I recognized immediately. The kind of silence that follows an argument that hasn't finished yet. My daughter hugged me at the door and held on longer than usual. My son-in-law shook my hand. "Not Dad, not thank you," just the handshake. I noticed but said nothing. His landscaping business had collapsed that summer. A bad contract, a worse partner, and a line of credit that had been leaned on too heavily for too long. He was 42, proud in the way some men are proud, where it calcifies into something that can't bend without breaking. I knew the type. I'd worked with them for decades on job sites. Good in good weather. Difficult when it rained. My house is a 4-bedroom detached on a quiet street in the Etobicoke. I paid it off in 2008, 2 years after my wife passed. It's not large, but it's solid. I built the back deck myself. I know every creak in every floorboard. The first few months were fine. My daughter cooked some evenings. My son-in-law helped with yard work. We ate together most nights and kept a polite distance. I gave them the large guest room and kept my study to myself, which I thought was a reasonable arrangement. Then things shifted. It happens gradually enough that you almost miss it. Month 6, I came into the kitchen to find the furniture in the sunroom rearranged. My son-in-law had decided the old layout wasn't efficient. Month 8, he asked me to turn down the television by 9 because he had early starts. I went to bed at 10:30 and have for 20 years, but I turned down the television. Month 10, I overheard my daughter telling someone on the phone that things at home were a bit cramped. It's his house, you know how it is. His house said like a limitation, like something to be apologized for. Small things. I told myself they were small things. I had paid for the lawyer who helped dissolve the business properly, $4,200. Cash, no discussion. I paid for the car insurance when my son-in-law's lapsed because he forgot to renew it. $600. I bought groceries for 4 people every week. I paid the gas, the hydro, the internet. My daughter worked part-time at a dental office. My son-in-law picked up occasional cash work through former contacts. Neither contributed to the household costs. I didn't ask them to. I thought I was helping. I kept a ledger, old habit, not to use against anyone, just because I can't not. By the 2nd year, respect had become expectation. Expectation had become something harder. I'd sit in my own living room and feel like I was waiting to be acknowledged. My son-in-law would walk past without speaking. My daughter would look away when he did it. The silence she kept was its own kind of wound, worse than anything he said directly. The week before Thanksgiving, my son-in-law told me his friends from Brampton would be coming for dinner. He told me, not asked me. I said I'd prepare the meal. He said great, and walked away. I spent 3 days cooking. Roasted the turkey, made the stuffing from scratch, baked butter tart squares because my grandson loves them. He's 9, my daughter's son from a previous relationship, and he is the clearest conscience in that house. He helped me peel potatoes that morning, standing on his step stool at the counter, asking questions about everything. Grandpa, why does stuffing need celery? Grandpa, when will they get here? Grandpa, are we going to eat soon? I told him soon. I was right about that, at least. 4 couples arrived at 3 o'clock. People I'd met once or twice. My son-in-law greeted them at the door like it was his door. Took their coats, offered them drinks from my bar, laughed loudly in the front hallway. I came out to the kitchen to say hello, and he stepped smoothly between me and the nearest couple. He didn't introduce me. He just moved the group toward the living room and kept talking. One of the wives eventually found me near the kitchen doorway. She asked if I was the caterer. I smiled and said I was the owner. She looked embarrassed. My son-in-law, who had heard this, turned and laughed. That's the old man. He's been staying with us. Staying with us? I went back into the kitchen. I stood at the counter and looked out the window at the backyard I'd landscaped myself over 30 years. The maple tree I planted the year my daughter was born. The deck I built the summer she left for university. The fence I repaired 6 months after my wife's funeral because I needed something to do with my hands. My grandson appeared at my elbow. You okay, Grandpa? I'm good, bud. Just checking on the turkey. Why does he say it's his house? Kids hear everything. Always have. I told him it was complicated. He said okay and went back to the table. Dinner was set for 5. I carried the turkey out on the roasting pan and set it in the center of the table. My good dishes were out, the ones my wife and I had bought at a shop in Kingston on our anniversary trip in 1997. Every eye followed the bird the way they always do. Someone said it looked incredible. My son-in-law nodded. He'd been working on it all day, he said. I set the pan down and stood at the end of the table, where I've stood every Thanksgiving for 31 years. I've carved the turkey at this table since the first year I owned this house. I pulled out my chair and started to sit. My son-in-law's voice cut through the room. We're actually full up here. There's no spot for you. Go ahead and eat in the kitchen. The room went quiet. Someone's wine glass clinked against a plate. One of the women shifted in her chair. My grandson stopped moving. I looked at my daughter. She was staring at her napkin. I looked at my son-in-law. He had a small smile, the kind that means he's decided something and is daring you to disagree. I stood back up. I didn't raise my voice. I'm not a man who raises his voice. I said, you must have forgotten whose name is on the deed. He laughed. Not nervous. Genuine amusement, like I'd told a joke he didn't find that funny. Don't make a scene at our dinner, he said. Adults are eating. Go eat in the kitchen or go for a walk. Be grateful we let you stay. Be grateful we let you stay. That sentence has a particular weight. It takes something you thought was yours and makes you a guest in it. I have a brother in Hamilton who's been telling me for 2 years that I was too soft, too patient, that I'd let this go too far. He was right, but sometimes you need to hear the words said plainly before you know what you know. I set down the serving spoon I'd been holding. I straightened up. Then I did something that, from the look on my son-in-law's face, he absolutely did not see coming. I walked to the front closet, reached past the coats, and took out the gray document binder I'd placed on the top shelf 3 days earlier. I'd put it there on purpose. The way you leave an umbrella by the door when you know the forecast. I brought it to the dining room table, stood at the head, opened it, and placed the top document face up in the center, next to the turkey. Certificate of title, my name, date of purchase, 1993. Then I took out my phone and called the non-emergency OPP line for Toronto. The room changed texture the way rooms do when something real happens. One of the men pushed his chair back slightly. A woman put her hand on her husband's arm. My son-in-law's smile disappeared. Yes, I said into the phone, I need to report a situation at my home. I've asked guests to leave and they are refusing. I'm the sole property owner. My address is here on Fairway Crescent in Etobicoke. They told me to call back if the situation escalated, and they'd send someone. I thanked them and ended the call. My son-in-law stood as you completely lost it. You're insane. His friends were already looking for their coats. One couple made it to the door in under a minute. I don't blame them. Nobody wants to be between a family and its reckoning. I want everyone who does not own this property to leave, I said, calmly. The way I used to say it on job sites when a situation needed to be contained. You have a few minutes to gather what you need. The guests were gone in 4 minutes. I timed it without meaning to. My daughter was crying. My son-in-law was furious, pacing the dining room, saying I had no right, saying he had squatters' rights, saying he'd sue me. My grandson sat very still at the corner of the table, and that image, that small boy sitting still in a room full of adult chaos, was what I held on to that night. I looked at my daughter. I told her she was welcome to stay, that this was still her home too, but that her husband was not welcome anymore, not tonight, and we would talk about the rest when we were calm. She looked at him. He said there was no way he was leaving without her. She looked back at me. Then she picked up her son, wrapped him in his coat, and followed her husband out the door. They spent the night at a Holiday Inn on Dixon Road. I know this because my grandson texted me from his mom's phone at 9 o'clock. We're okay, Grandpa. I saved you a butter tart square. He'd brought one in a napkin. I ate Thanksgiving dinner alone that night. I didn't mind as much as I thought I would. I changed the locks the next morning. Locksmith from Rexdale, good price, all 3 exterior doors done by 10. I sat with my coffee and held the new keys and felt something I hadn't felt in over 2 years. The house was quiet and it was mine. I spent the morning in my study with my ledger. I'd been keeping it since they moved in, the same way I tracked materials costs on a construction project. Methodical, unemotional, just numbers. September 2022 through November 2024, the total was $68,400. That included $12,000 I'd transferred to my daughter when her car needed major work and she had nothing saved. The $6,000 I'd given my son-in-law when a former client threatened legal action over a landscaping dispute and he needed a retainer. Monthly increased costs in hydro, groceries, and household expenses. Every figure had a bank record or a receipt behind it. I called my oldest friend, a retired family lawyer named Perry, who lives 2 streets over. We'd been playing crib together every other Tuesday for 20 years. He was at my door with coffee before I'd finished explaining. He looked through my documents for a long time without saying anything, which is Perry's way of being thorough. Then he said I'd documented everything better than most people who come to him professionally, which he said with a slight air of surprise, and I reminded him I was an engineer for 4 decades. He told me what I likely already knew. They had no tenancy agreement, no rent paid, no documentation of any contribution to the property. In Ontario, without a formal lease, a person staying in a home at the owner's invitation is a licensee, not a tenant. The invitation can be withdrawn. I'd withdrawn it. He said my son-in-law might try to claim unjust enrichment or resulting trust based on any improvements to the property. I told him my son-in-law had fixed a screen door once and re-stained the deck stairs using my stain. Perry said that was not going to help him. He gave me the name of a litigation lawyer he trusted. Wendy, mid-50s, downtown Toronto, the kind of calm that comes from having seen everything. I called her that afternoon. My daughter called 3 times that week. I let the first 2 go to voicemail. The 3rd time I picked up. She said she was sorry. She said she'd known things had gotten out of hand and hadn't said anything. She said that was a failure on her part, and she used those words exactly. I believed her. I told her I loved her. I told her I wasn't angry with her in the way I was angry with him. But I told her I needed her to understand that the last 2 years had cost me something I couldn't fully name yet, and that her silence at that table had been the part that hurt most. She said she knew. We didn't talk much longer than that. My son-in-law called once. He told me I was a bitter old man with nothing better to do than destroy his family. He said he had rights. I told him that was a conversation for lawyers and ended the call. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, an envelope arrived at my door. Certified mail, which means someone wanted to make sure I received it. I signed for it at the door, brought it inside, and opened it at my desk with my reading glasses on. Statement of claim, filed with the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. My son-in-law was suing me for constructive trust over the property, citing his 2+ years of residency and alleged contributions to the home. He was claiming an interest in the property. He had retained a paralegal from a discount legal services firm out of Mississauga. I called Perry first, then Wendy. Perry laughed, not unkindly, and said that was about what he'd expected. Wendy said the claim had significant problems and she'd draft a response. I called my brother in Hamilton. He said he told me so, which is true and fair, and also said he'd come down that weekend to help me go through the paperwork, which is the more important part. He drove down Saturday morning with a dozen Timbits and we sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours. He's a practical man. Doesn't make things larger than they are. I needed that. Wendy filed the response 2 weeks later. Comprehensive documentation. Bank records showing every dollar I'd spent on the household. Hydro bills, grocery receipts, the 2 cash gifts, the car repair, the legal retainer. An email from my daughter, sent in July of the previous year, thanking me for letting them stay at my house. 3 words. My house. She hadn't meant it as evidence. It became evidence anyway. The motion hearing was in February. Same winter cold. Different courthouse. Wendy was crisp and prepared. The paralegal from Mississauga was not. The judge, a composed man in his late 60s with the patience of someone who has heard every variation of every argument, went straight to the key issue. In Ontario, constructive trust requires demonstrated contribution of value to the property and an expectation of compensation at the time of contribution. What demonstrated contributions are we talking about? The paralegal offered testimony of general upkeep and household labor. The judge asked for documentation. There was none. The judge reviewed Wendy's exhibit package for 4 minutes without speaking. Then he asked the paralegal if he'd reviewed the claimant's residency timeline against Ontario's limitations on adverse possession. The paralegal began to answer, and the judge moved on before he finished. Motion dismissed. My son-in-law was ordered to pay partial costs of $30,400. In the corridor afterward, he was shaking. Not from cold. My daughter was beside him, holding her purse with both hands, looking at the floor. My grandson wasn't there, which I was glad about. My son-in-law started toward me. Wendy stepped sideways. She didn't say anything. She just stood in the space between us, and somehow that was enough. He said this wasn't over. He said I'd regret it. My daughter touched his arm. He shrugged her off and walked toward the elevator. She looked at me. I looked back. There was nothing to say in that moment that would have been enough, so neither of us said anything. I walked back to Wendy's car and looked at the street. Downtown Toronto in February, grey and cold and entirely ordinary. I felt very little except tired. The investigation was not something I'd planned. It began because I asked a question. I'd known my son-in-law had worked in landscaping and commercial property maintenance in the years before he started his own company. In the months after the court motion was dismissed, I did something I used to do out of professional habit. I made some calls. I reached out to a former colleague from my years in commercial construction, a man named Earl who'd spent the last decade doing insurance, adjusting work for a company out of Burlington. We'd kept in loose touch. I bought him lunch at a diner in Hamilton in March and told him what had happened and asked, honestly, just as a question between colleagues, whether he knew anything about my son-in-law's company or its history. Earl was quiet for a moment. He said he remembered a claim. Commercial property on a contract job in Oakville, 2020. Remediation work, water damage. Claim was filed for an amount that hadn't matched what the remediation actually cost. He'd flagged it internally. The company went bankrupt before the file went anywhere. He said he still had the documentation. He said he'd been meaning to follow up and never had. I told him that following up was probably still worth doing. He agreed. I gave him Wendy's contact information in case anyone needed a reference. We shook hands and I paid for the lunch. I drove back to Etobicoke along the QEW with the radio off, watching the lake through the passenger window. I felt no satisfaction in any of this. Only the particular weight of watching someone be exactly who you suspected they were all along. The referral went to FSSRA, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority. They work with insurers. The original insurer opened a review. I didn't hear details. I wasn't meant to. I'd simply been a former family connection who had relevant contact information. By spring, word moved through the small world of Etobicoke tradespeople the way word always moves, sideways and fast. Someone my son-in-law had been doing cash work for let him go. Someone else declined to use him. I heard this from my brother, who heard it from his neighbor, who knows people. I didn't chase the information. It just arrived. My daughter left him in April. She called me on a Tuesday evening from a friend's apartment in Scarborough. Her voice was flat, the way it gets when she's past the worst of it, and into the part where she just needs to move. She said she'd found out about the insurance situation. She said she'd known, somewhere, that he wasn't honest, but that she hadn't let herself look at it directly. She said living through what happened at Thanksgiving and then watching him try to take my home had finally made her look. She said she was sorry, not for the first time, but differently this time. She asked if she could come home. I asked if she'd be bringing my grandson. She said yes. I said come home. They moved back in the first weekend of May. My grandson brought his Lego collection, which now occupies most of the sunroom, and I have not complained about this once. He comes to the kitchen in the mornings while I make coffee and asks questions about whatever is on his mind. Last week he asked me how bridges work, and I explained load distribution to him for 45 minutes. He followed every word. Smart kid. My daughter got a full-time position at the dental office. She's saving money. We have worked out a clear and honest household arrangement. Written down, both of us signed it at the kitchen table one evening in June. It's not a legal document, it's just an honest one. We filed the civil claim in June. Wendy prepared it carefully. $68,000 in documented expenses, supported by 6 folders of evidence. My son-in-law was served at the room he was renting in Mississauga. His response, through the same paralegal, was thin and defensive. The hearing was in September. He sat across the courtroom looking diminished in a way that had nothing to do with clothes or a haircut. My daughter was not present. She had offered to come. I told her it wasn't necessary. The judge reviewed the documentation the way good judges do, methodically, without theatrics. The email from my daughter, the bank records, the receipts, the ledger I'd maintained. She said the evidence was comprehensive and the claim was well supported. She noted the defendant had presented no credible rebuttal documentation. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $68,400. Payment terms of $600 per month, given demonstrated limited income, joint and several with any co-borrowing arrangement, enforceable by wage garnishment if default occurred. At that payment rate, it would take approximately 9.5 years. His financial life would carry the weight of what he'd done for the better part of a decade. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved, which is different. In the corridor, he passed me on the way to the elevator. He stopped and looked at me. I expected another threat, another version of "this isn't over, you'll regret this." He didn't say anything. He just looked at me for a moment with something in his face that might have been shame or might have been defeat. And then he got in the elevator. I walked down the stairs. Perry came over that evening for crib. We sat at the kitchen table with tea. My daughter was upstairs. My grandson was in the sunroom with his Lego. I could hear him narrating something to himself in a low voice. The private stories kids tell when they don't know anyone's listening. Perry won 2 out of 3 hands, which is more or less the usual. He asked me how I felt. I said I felt like I had my house back. Not just the physical house, though that too. The version of my house where I could sit at my own table, walk through my own rooms, drink my coffee at 5 in the morning in my own kitchen without feeling like a visitor in my own life. He said that seemed worth protecting. I said it was. I dealt the next hand and we played until 10. The November dark pressed against the windows again, the same way it had 2 years ago when I stood at the counter making stuffing at sunrise. But this time when I looked out at the yard, I felt what the yard was. It was mine. The maple tree, the deck, the fence I built with my own hands. Some things you have to lose before you understand what they were. I've been a structural engineer most of my life. I know what holds a thing up. I know what happens when the weight gets distributed wrong, when something that was designed for a purpose gets used for something else entirely. You document everything, you do the math, you wait for the load to make itself known. Then you make it right. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the courtroom, not the locksmith, not even Thanksgiving night itself. It's my grandson standing at the counter on a step stool asking me why stuffing needs celery. That's the moment I think about most. Because while everything around us was heading somewhere difficult and inevitable, that boy was just trying to understand how things work. And that's all any of us are really doing, if we're honest about it. I spent 38 years as a structural engineer. The job teaches you something that takes a while to name properly. It teaches you that things fail in predictable ways when the weight is distributed wrong. Not suddenly, gradually. One calculation ignored, one assumption left unchecked, and eventually the whole thing comes down. What happened in my house over 2 years and 4 months wasn't a surprise. It was a load bearing down on a structure I'd been too patient to reinforce. I don't think my son-in-law was born dishonest. I think he made small choices that compounded. He let someone else carry his weight and then told himself he'd earned the right to direct the load. That's not a mystery, that's cause and effect, plain and simple. The investigation, the court costs, the 9.5 years of payments, none of that was punishment handed down from somewhere above. It was just consequence catching up to conduct. It always does. The math always closes. What I had to learn, and it took me longer than it should have, was that being decent to people isn't the same as letting them make you small. I stayed quiet for too long because I confused patience with generosity. I thought absorbing the disrespect was somehow the kind thing to do. It wasn't. It was just avoidance with a kinder name. Real decency means holding the line. It means saying clearly, this is my home, and these are the terms, and I won't pretend otherwise to make someone comfortable who isn't earning that comfort. My daughter understood this eventually. That's the part I'm most grateful for. Not the judgment, not the documentation, not even having my house back. The part that matters is that she looked at what happened clearly and chose to understand it instead of defending it. That takes something. It takes more than most people realize to look at a situation you helped create and say out loud, I was wrong and I knew better and I didn't act. She did that. She's rebuilding. I respect her for it. My grandson asked me last week how bridges stay up. I told him about load distribution, about how a well-designed structure spreads weight evenly so no single point carries more than it was built to hold. He thought about it for a second and then said, so you have to be fair to all the parts. I told him that was exactly right. You can build anything that lasts on an uneven foundation. Not a bridge, not a business, not a family. What holds things up in the end isn't luck or sentiment. It's the quiet, unglamorous work of knowing what you're carrying, doing the math honestly, and being willing to reinforce the structure before it fails. I'm 64 years old. I've built a few things in my life that are still standing. I intend to build a few more.